Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to discuss the effect of Martin Luther's teachings as his ideas spread to create what is called the European Reformation. So, here's our objectives for today. We're going to explain the effects of the spread of Protestant ideas. We're going to compare the teachings of Martin Luther to other Reformation thinkers, most specifically John Calvin. And then we're going to look at how successful the Reformation religious communities were. So, the Reformation, of course, started with Martin Luther, who was teaching and preaching within the Holy Roman Empire. As we remember last time, Martin Luther was put on trial for his beliefs, but was eventually sheltered by a German prince who was sympathetic to his religious mission. His ideas were also embraced in England, but for very different reasons. Of course, we remember Henry VIII was less about piety and religious practice, and much more about wanting to grant himself a divorce. So, those are the areas we've talked about so far. We're going to talk about the rest of the Holy Roman Empire here, and a little bit of Scotland, and that down into the Swiss Confederation down in the south. So, Martin Luther, in one of his writings, the Treatise on Christian Liberty, said that, quote, "To make the way smoother for the unlearned, for only them do I serve, I shall set down the following two propositions considering freedom and bondage of the spirit. Quote, a Christian is perfectly free, lord of all, and subject to none. 2. A Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all." The problem with this is, as often happens, people tend to read what they want into this, and so for a lot of peasants, they heard that, quote, a Christian is a perfectly free lord of all, subject to none, and decided that they didn't want to be serfs for their lords anymore. Especially in the Holy Roman Empire, serfs generally lived unbelievably brutal lives, and so German peasants decided that, hey, Luther said we are perfectly free, subject to nobody. So let's get our pikes, go burn down the Lord's manor, kill anyone who opposes us, and try to free ourselves. Luther, of course, ignoring the second piece where they're subject to all, but again, people read what they wanted out of it. And so as you can see on this map, the German Peasants' War of 1525 broke out all across here, massive amounts of both urban and rural violence, and lords fleeing for their lives, unable to afford to put together the modern expensive armies that rulers were able to, and stop the violence and bloodshed. Luther, of course, was horrified by this and was like, no, guys, seriously, I was talking about, like, in heaven, not, like, on earth. You still need to do what your Lord says. And so wrote this later treatise, quote, against the robbing, murdering hordes of peasants. Quote, they cause uproar and sacrilegiously rob and pillage monasteries and castles that do not belong to them, for which, like public highwaymen and murderers, they deserve the twofold death of body and soul. He goes on, but it's pretty straightforward. Luther argues that this war should be put down, which it eventually is, with massive loss of life. This is more or less the end of Luther as a popular figure. The peasants were hoping that Luther would come out of hiding and lead them to victory over the lords, and instead he encouraged the lords to suppress the rebellion brutally, which they then did with gusto. So, German Peasants' War failed. Luther does not become a popular religious leader, and massive death and loss of life, and returned to the status quo in the Holy Roman Empire. In the aftermath of this, however, the Peace of Augsburg did establish that German princes were able to choose either Catholicism or Lutheranism, and if some preachers wanted to go over to Luther's side, they were very willing to do so. Or they were able to do so, and the Holy Roman Empire would not try to force religious uniformity on the Holy Roman Empire, at least not yet. Another philosopher who took Luther's idea that everyone can interpret the Bible is John Calvin, and he came up with this theory of predestination that says, quote, the covenant of life not being equally preached to all, and among those to whom it is preached not always finding the same reception, this diversity discovers the wonderful depth of the divine judgment. Nor is it to be doubted that this variety also follows, subject to the decision of God's eternal election. It is evidently the result of the divine will that salvation is freely offered to some, and others are prevented from attaining it. So, this meant, according to Calvin, that God chose some people at the beginning of time to be saved, and some people to cast into hell. You didn't do anything to choose this. This is part of building upon Luther's salvation by grace, not by works. But there's nothing you can do to earn God's election. He simply chose you at the beginning of time, or he didn't. And it's up to you to figure out, did God choose you? And then, if he did, how do you then live up to the high standard that God has set for you? Calvin's followers eventually took control of a city in Switzerland called Geneva, where they destroyed all traditional Catholic icons, forced everyone to convert to Calvinism, and then created a council of elders to police people's behavior because they theorized, we want to live in a city only of perfectly elect people that God has chosen to save. And so, how do you know that you're a member of the elect? Well, a member of the elect would do, if God chose you to be saved, clearly you're a good person. And then a good person would do stuff like act properly and go to church and wear muted colors and not swear and not drink and work hard and things like that. So they would then live as an example to others in order to try to create this utopia on earth. It should be noted that these actions do not allow you to earn God's election. Nothing can do that. But they do show that maybe God did choose you. So it's certainly not salvation by works, but at some point we're arguing semantics here. Then there are the Anabaptists, who argue that really it's only the relationship with God that's important. And so, quote, and you need to choose that relationship with God, and once that happens, it breaks all sort of mortal chains and obligations, and your born-again soul is now free from everything else. Anabaptists practiced adult baptism, arguing that baptizing children takes the agency out of it. And so, quote, they objected to not only infant baptism, but also denied the divinity of Christ, said that he was not born to the Virgin Mary, and they often lived in sort of communal structures, denouncing private property and urging that all goods be owned by the people in common. And they also refused to accept any type of non-religious authority. So, Holy Roman Empire has no power over me. I've been baptized again. I'm living in this perfect utopian community. Just because you say I have to pay taxes to you doesn't mean I have to pay taxes to you. As you might imagine, rulers did not like the Anabaptists. And, quote, in a proclamation in November, they were ordered by the king to leave the realm, and those who remained were persecuted and burned. And so it was pretty common for Anabaptists to try to live in these perfect utopian communities and for the people around them to destroy them. The largest example of this is the Moonster Rebellion, when a group of Anabaptists seizes control of the German town of Münster, led by two Jans, Jan Matthijs and the other guy whose name I don't remember, and you probably don't need to know it. Anyway, they took over the town, killed everyone who refused to be baptized again, and then tried to live as this perfect utopian community. As often happens, the Jans became somewhat corrupt. They also started arguing that everyone should be married to everyone else, and they got to have lots of wives, and that they should collect all the property that's owned communally just for safekeeping. And so there was some resistance there, which then they brutally suppressed. And then the other German princes surrounded the city of Münster, built huge siege walls around it, starved the city out, and eventually stormed it and killed all the Anabaptists that they found. So the Moonster Rebellion is the largest example of Anabaptists seizing control of an entire medieval city. So what's the legacy of all of this? As all of these new beliefs flowed, flourished, developed, it allowed people to jump into new ideas. It also increased literacy as people wanted to read these new tracts, and as these new tracts were then published in people's national languages in the vernacular instead of in Latin, it increased literacy in those languages. And as the church lost power, individual rulers used this, like Henry VIII, to seize control of their local churches. So some people converted to Lutheranism because they liked the ideas, but for a lot of rulers, it meant that if they converted to Lutheranism, what about all this church property? Now, all of a sudden, maybe it's up for grabs. And so for a lot of German princes, they could seize monasteries, seize churches, cathedrals, and some of the tithe money would then go to them as opposed to the Pope in Rome. So it became also there was also an economic benefit to converting to Protestantism as well. And of course, it led to massive amounts of death and chaos. Here's your basic divisions of Christianity. The early church split into the Eastern and Roman Catholic break in the first schism when the Roman Empire divided. And then the Reformation broke off all of these Protestant groups And then the differing beliefs between these Protestants broke off into all these different sects. Your Lutherans, your Anglicans, who eventually became Episcopalians, stuff like that. Your Calvinists, who then became Presbyterians, Congregationalists, groups like that. So that's the effect of the spread of Protestant ideas. And hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail. And thank you. And for next time, we're going to talk about the Catholic Church's response to all of this, which I'm sure you will not be surprised to hear is not going to be pretty. Thank you for listening.